I'm Frances, and welcome to my channel. Okay, so today I am hoping to finish up the inverted forest. This will be part 3. I don't want to do it in 4 parts, although I may have to. It depends on if I can get through this, and I really hope that I can. So here we go, and we ended the part 2 with Corrine writing a letter to her friend Robert Wayner, and she had signed it Love C. So here we go. Hopefully with the rest of the story. I'm hoping I can get this done in 3 parts. But if it ends up being 4, sorry, I'm losing my voice. I'm drinking my hibiscus tea. One moment. If it ends up being 4, as I said, they'll all be on here, and you can go from the first to the second, the third, the fourth. But I'm hoping I can get through it now. Okay, so here we go. On Monday evening, May the 10th, 1937, Mr. and Mrs. Ford, who had been married 3 weeks to the day, met Miss Croft outside the Alvin Theater, and the 3 went inside together to attend the performance of Hiya, Broadway Hiya. After the theater, the 3 went to the bar of the Wayland Hotel, where, just after the midnight performance of some singers known as the Rancheros, Mr. Ford leaned across the table and in a very cordial manner invited Miss Croft to attend his lecture at the Institute the following morning. Mrs. Ford impulsively reached forward and pressed her husband's hand. The 3 people remained at the Wayland bar until approximately 1 a.m., speaking together in a most friendly manner and watching the entertainment. Mr. and Mrs. Ford dropped Miss Croft off at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel at approximately 1:10 a.m. Emotionally, almost at the point of tears, Miss Croft thanked Mr. and Mrs. Ford for the loveliest evening of my life. Mrs. Ford held her husband's hand as the taxi continued on its way to their apartment house. Mr. Ford remarked as they ascended in the elevator to their apartment that he had a splitting headache. Once they were inside their apartment, Mrs. Ford insisted that Mr. Ford take 2 aspirins, one for being the best boy in the world, and one to make him eligible to kiss his wife. On Tuesday morning, May the 11th, Miss Croft attended Mr. Ford's 11 o'clock lecture, sitting in the rearmost seat in the lecture hall. She then accompanied Mr. Ford to lunch at a Chinese-type restaurant located 3 blocks south of the university. Mr. Ford quietly mentioned this fact to Mrs. Ford at dinner. Mrs. Ford asked Mr. Ford which table he and Miss Croft had sat at. Mr. Ford said he didn't remember. Near the door, he believed. Mrs. Ford asked Mr. Ford what he and Miss Croft had talked about at lunch. Mr. Ford replied quietly that he was sorry, but that he really hadn't brought along a dictograph for lunch. After dinner, Mrs. Ford informed her husband that she was going to take the dog for a walk. She asked Mr. Ford if he would like to join her, but he declined, saying he had a great deal of work to look over. When Mrs. Ford returned to the apartment 2 hours later, from a walk up Park Avenue, almost as far as the Spanish Quarter, the lights were out both in Mr. Ford's study and in his bedroom. Mrs. Ford sat alone in the living room until shortly after 2 a.m., at which time she heard Mr. Ford screaming in his bedroom. She then burst into Mr. Ford's bedroom, where she found Mr. Ford apparently asleep in his bed. He continued to scream, although Mrs. Ford shook him as violently as she was able. His pajamas and sheets were wringing wet with perspiration. When Mr. Ford came to, he reached at once for his glasses on the night table. Even with his glasses on, he seemed unable for several seconds to recognize his wife, although Mrs. Ford frantically continued to identify herself. At last, staring at her evenly, he spoke her name, but with great difficulty, like a man physically and emotionally exhausted. Mrs. Ford, stammering badly, told Mr. Ford that she was going to get him a cup of hot milk. She then moved unsteadily out to the kitchen, poured some milk into a pot, searched rather wildly for the magic ignition light, finally found it. She heated the milk and returned with a cup of it to her husband's room. Mr. Ford was now asleep again, with his hands clenched at his sides. Mrs. Ford set the cup of milk on the night table and climbed into bed beside Mr. Ford. She lay awake the rest of the night. Mr. Ford did not scream again in his sleep, but between the hours of 4 and 5 a.m., for nearly 3/4 of an hour, he wept. Mrs. Ford maneuvered her whole body as close as possible to Mr. Ford's, but there seemed to be no way of relieving him of his sorrow or even of reaching it. Wednesday morning, May the 12th, at breakfast, Mrs. Ford casually, so she thought, asked Mr. Ford what he had dreamed during the night. Mr. Ford looked up from his dry cornflakes and replied unelaborately that last night he had dreamed his first unpleasant dream in a long time. Mrs. Ford asked him again what he had dreamed. Mr. Ford replied quietly that nightmares are nightmares and that he could get along without a Freudian analysis. Mrs. Ford said, equally quietly, so she thought, that she didn't want to give Mr. Ford a Freudian analysis, even were she qualified to do so. She said she was merely Mr. Ford's wife and that she wanted to make Mr. Ford happy. She began to cry. Mr. Ford placed his face between his hands, but after a moment he stood up and left the room. Mrs. Ford rushed after him and found him standing in the outer hall, holding his briefcase but without his hat. He was waiting for the elevator. Mrs. Ford asked Mr. Ford whether he loved her, but at that instant the elevator doors opened and Mr. Ford, entering the car without his hat, said he would see Mrs. Ford at dinner. Mrs. Ford dressed and went to her office. Her behavior at the magazine offices that Wednesday afternoon might be called erratic. She was observed to slap the face of Mr. Robert Weiner when the latter lightly addressed her at an editor's meeting as Mary Sunshine. After said act, Mrs. Ford apologized to Mr. Weiner, but did not accept his invitation to accompany him to Maxie's bar for a drink. At 7 p.m., Mr. Ford telephoned his apartment and told Mrs. Ford that he would not be home to dine as he was obliged to attend a faculty meeting at the university. Mr. Ford did not come home until 11:15 p.m., at which time Mrs. Ford, who was out walking her wire-haired terrier, encountered him on the street. Mr. Ford objected when the dog attempted to greet him by jumping on his person. Mrs. Ford pointed out that Mr. Ford ought to be flattered that Malcolm, the dog, had learned to love him so much in such a short time. Mr. Ford said he could get along without having Malcolm jump all over him with his filthy paws. Then they went up in the elevator together. Mr. Ford remarked that he had a great deal of work to look over and went into his study. Mrs. Ford went into her own room and closed the door. At breakfast, Thursday morning, May 13th, Mrs. Ford remarked to her husband that she wished she hadn't made a theater date with the Little Croft girl for that night. Mrs. Ford said she was tired and didn't care to see the play a second time, but that Miss Croft ought to see Bankhead if she had never seen her. Mr. Ford nodded. Then Mrs. Ford asked him if by chance he had seen Bunny Croft again. Mr. Ford asked in reply how in the world could he possibly have seen Miss Croft. Mrs. Ford said she didn't know. She said she just thought Miss Croft might have attended his lecture again. Mr. Ford finished his breakfast, kissed Mrs. Ford goodbye, and left. Thursday evening, Mrs. Ford waited outside the Morosco Theater until 8:50 p.m., at which time she went to the box office, left a ticket in Miss Croft's name, and entered the theater alone. At the end of the first act of the play, she went directly home, arriving there at approximately 9:40 p.m. She learned at the door from Rita, the maid, that Mr. Ford had not yet come home from his Thursday evening class and that his dinner was getting ice cold. She instructed Rita to clear the table. Mrs. Ford stayed in a hot bath until she felt a little faint. Then she dressed herself for the street, leashed Malcolm, and took him out for a walk. Mrs. Ford and Malcolm walked 5 blocks north and 1 block west and inbred a popular restaurant. Mrs. Ford left Malcolm in the check room. Then she sat down at the bar and in the course of an hour drank 3 Scotch old-fashions. Then she and the dog returned to the apartment, arriving there at approximately 11:45 p.m. Mr. Ford still had not arrived home. Mrs. Ford immediately left her apartment again, leaving Malcolm behind. She went down in the elevator, and the apartment house doorman got her a taxi. She ordered the driver to stop at 42nd Street and Broadway. There, she got out of the taxi and proceeded west on foot. She entered the Deluxe Theater, an all-night movie house, and stayed there throughout one complete performance, seeing 2 full-length films, 4 short subjects, and a newsreel. She then left the Deluxe Theater and went by taxi directly home, arriving there at 3:40 a.m. Mr. Ford still had not arrived home. Mrs. Ford immediately went down in the elevator again with Malcolm. At approximately 4 a.m., having twice walked completely around the block, Mrs. Ford encountered Mr. Ford under the canopy of their apartment house as he was getting out of a taxi. He was wearing a new hat. Mrs. Ford said hello to Mr. Ford and asked him where did he get the hat. Mr. Ford did not seem to hear the question. As Mr. and Mrs. Ford ascended in the elevator together, Mrs. Ford's knees suddenly buckled. Mr. Ford tried to draw Mrs. Ford up to a normal standing position, but his attempt was strangely incompetent, and it was the elevator operator who lent Mrs. Ford real assistance. Mr. Ford seemed to have great difficulty inserting his key into the lock of his apartment door. He suddenly turned and asked Mrs. Ford if she thought he was drunk. Somewhat inarticulately, Mrs. Ford replied that she did think Mr. Ford had been drinking. Mr. Ford asked her to speak more distinctly. Mrs. Ford said again that she thought Mr. Ford had been drinking. Mr. Ford, successfully unlocking his front door, stated in a loud voice that he had eaten an olive from her martini. Mrs. Ford, trembling, asked from whose martini? From her martini, Mr. Ford repeated. As the two entered their apartment together, Mrs. Ford, still trembling, asked her husband whether he knew that Miss Croft had left her standing at the Morosco Theater. Mr. Ford's reply was unintelligible. He walked, swaying perceptibly toward his bedroom. At approximately 5 a.m., Mrs. Ford heard Mr. Ford get out of his bed and, apparently ill, go into his bathroom. With the use of sedatives, Mrs. Ford fell asleep at approximately 7 a.m. She awoke at approximately 11:10 a.m., at which time she rang for her maid, who informed her that Mr. Ford had left the apartment more than an hour ago. Mrs. Ford immediately dressed and, without eating breakfast, went by taxi to her office. At approximately 1:10 p.m., Mr. Ford telephoned Mrs. Ford at her office to say that he was at Pennsylvania Station and that he was leaving New York with Miss Croft. He said that he was very sorry and then hung up. Mrs. Ford carefully replaced her phone and then fainted, loosening one of her front teeth against a filing cabinet. As she was alone in her office and no one had heard her fall, she remained unconscious for several minutes. She regained consciousness by herself. She then drank a quarter of a glass of brandy and went home. At home, she found Mr. Ford's bedroom and closets completely empty of his few personal effects. She then rushed into Mr. Ford's study, followed by Rita the maid, who explained rather laconically that Mr. Ford himself had pushed the desk back against the wall. Mrs. Ford looked slowly around the freshly reconverted playroom, then again fainted. On May the 23rd, another Sunday, Rita the maid rapped imperiously on the door of Corinne's bedroom. Corinne told her to come in. It was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Corinne was lying on her bed, fully dressed. Her window blinds were drawn down. She knew vaguely that she was a fool not to let the sun shine into the room, but in 9 days she had grown to hate the sight of it. "I can't hear you," she said without turning over to face Rita's unattractive voice. "I said, check the doorman's on the house phone," Rita said. "He says there's a gentleman in the lobby wants to see you." "I don't want to see anybody, Rita. Find out who it is." "Yes, ma'am." Rita went out and came in again. "You know a Miss Craft or somebody?" she demanded. Corinne's body jumped under the bedspread she had drawn over her. "Tell whoever it is to come up." "Now?" "Yes, Rita, now." Corinne stood up unsteadily. "And will you please show him into the living room?" "I was just going to clean in there. I hadn't cleaned in there yet." "Show him into the living room, Rita, please." Rita walked sullenly out of the room. As people do who have chosen to live in a supine position, once she was on her feet, Corinne went into action a little crazily. It seemed of prime importance to her to take out from under her night table Ford's 2 books of poems and walk up and down the room with them for a little while. She suddenly replaced the books under her night table. Then she combed her hair and put on lipstick. Her dress was badly wrinkled, but she didn't change it. As she walked carefully into the living room, a man with wavy blonde hair stood up. The man was in his early 30s with a physique that was turning fat, but which had a look of tremendous animal power. He was wearing a pale green sports coat and a yellow polo shirt open at the collar. Several inches of white handkerchief drooped out of his breast pocket. Mrs. Ford? Yes. My card. He pushed something into Corinne's hand. Corinne slanted the card toward the daylight. I'm Howie Croft. Who the hell are you, bud? She started to return the card, but Mr. Howie Croft sank away from her into the upholstery of the couch, waving a hand. Keep it, he said generously. Framing the card in her hand, Corinne herself sat down in the red damask chair opposite her visitor. She asked a little stiffly, Are you closely related to Miss Croft? Are you kidding? Corinne's reply was delivered down her handsome nose. Mr. Croft, I'm not especially in the habit of... Look, hey, I'm Howie Croft. I'm Bunny's husband. Impressed, Corinne immediately fainted. When she came to, she had the choice of looking into either or both of the alarmed, faintly inconvenienced faces of Howie Croft and Rita. She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them. Howie Croft and Rita had placed her feet upon the couch. She swung them now, a trifle arrogantly, to the floor. I'm all right, Rita, she said. I'll take some of that, though. She drank half a pony of brandy. You can go, Rita. I'm all right. I'm damn sick and tired of fainting. As Rita left the room, Howie Croft moved uneasily over to the red damask chair Corinne had vacated. He sat down and crossed his legs, which were huge, each thing a whole athlete in itself. I'm sure sorry to have scared you that way, Mrs. Field. Ford. I meant Ford. I know a couple people named Field. Howie Croft uncrossed his legs. So you didn't know I and Bunny were married? No, I did not. Howie Croft laughed. Sure, we've been married 11 years, he said. Cigarette? He snapped the bottom of a fresh pack of cigarettes with his finger, then sociably, without getting up, extended the pack to Corinne. What do you mean you've been married 11 years? Corinne demanded coldly. For a split second, Howie Croft looked like a schoolboy, unjustly accused of chewing gum in class, but whose involuntary reaction is to swallow when challenged. Well, 10 years and 8 months, if you want to be so exact, he said. Cigarette? Something in Corinne's face told him to stop offering her a cigarette. He shrugged his forehead, lighted his own cigarette, put the pack back in his breast pocket, and carefully rearranged his handkerchief. Corinne spoke to him. I beg your pardon, Howie Croft said politely. Corinne repeated her question in a harsh voice. What girl's 20 years old? Howie Croft inquired. Your wife. Bunny? Howie Croft snorted. You're nuts. She's 31. She's a month older than me, and I'm 31. Swiftly, Corinne wondered whether doormen and people had sense enough to cover up immediately the bodies of people who jumped out of apartment house windows. She didn't want to jump without a guarantee that somebody would cover her up immediately. She forced herself to pick up Howie Croft's voice. She looks a lot younger, Howie Croft was analyzing, because she's got small bones. People with small bones don't get old the way people like you and I. Know what I mean? Corinne didn't reply to this question, but asked a question of her own. Howie Croft didn't hear her. I don't get you, he said and cupped his ear. Say that again. She repeated her question louder. Before replying, Howie Croft got rid of a troublesome bit of tobacco on his tongue. Then he said, not impatiently, Look, hey, she can't be 20. We got a kid 11 years old. Mr. Croft. Call me Howie, he suggested, unless you want to stand on this ceremony stuff. With a shiver, Corinne asked him if he were telling her the complete truth. Look, hey, what would I lie for? What would I lie for? How old did she tell you she was? But he waved away his interest in her reply. She's nuts, he pronounced rather cheerfully. She was always nuts. He settled back comfortably on the lower part of his spine and assumed the kind of philosophical countenance available to him. Look, hey, I come home on Thursday from this special trip I had to make for the farm. I look around the house, no Bunny anywheres, even though she was supposed to be back at least a week already, so I call up my mom. My mom tells me Bunny hasn't got back yet. She starts yelling her head off on the phone. She tells me the kid's broken his leg climbing on some roof. She keeps yelling over the phone about how she hasn't strength enough to take care of the kid. And where's his mother anyways? And so finally, I hang up. I can't stand somebody yelling in my ear over the phone. So I spent around an hour trying to put two and two together. So I know where I'm at least. And so finally I look in the mailbox and I see a letter from Bunny. She tells me her and this Ford guy are going away somewhere together. What a screwball. He shook his head. Corrine took a cigarette from the box on the table beside her and lighted it. She then cleared her throat as though to make sure her voice still functioned. Thursday. This is Sunday. It took you a long time to get here. Howie Croft finished what he was doing. He was blowing a smoke ring at the ceiling. Then he answered, look, I don't live on Park Avenue or somewheres. I work for a living. I go where the firm sends me. Corrine took her time. You mean you're here on business? Certainly I'm here on business, Howie Croft said indignantly. You let her come to New York? You knew she was coming here? Corrine asked dizzily. Certainly I knew she was coming here. You don't think I let her come all the ways to New York without knowing what's what, do you? It took him a moment to smooth out his feathers. She told me she wanted to meet this Ford guy, this Ford chap, your husband. So I figure, let her get it out of her system. She's driving me nuts. He's driving me nuts. He interrupted himself. Your husband makes a lot of dough writing books, don't he? He's written only 2 books of poems, Mr. Croft. I don't know about that, but he makes a lot of dough on what he writes, don't he? No. No? Incredulously. There's no money in poetry, Mr. Croft. Howie Croft looked suspiciously around. Who pays the rent here? He demanded. I do, shortly. Mr. Croft, must we? I don't get it. He turned to Corrine, a real appeal in his rather sizeless eyes. He's a big shot, isn't he? He's probably the finest poet in America. But he shook his head. If I'd known this, I wouldn't have let her come, he said bitterly. He looked at Corrine accusingly, as though she were personally responsible for his private dilemma. I thought your husband could kind of show her the ropes. What ropes? The ropes, Howie Croft said impatiently. She keeps writing these books. You know how many books she wrote since we've been married? 12. I read them all. The last one she wrote for Gary Cooper, for a picture with Gary Cooper in it. She sent it out to the movies, and they didn't even send it back. She's had some tough breaks. What? Corrine said sharply. I said she's had some tough breaks. Corrine felt her cigarette burning hotly close to her finger. She unloosened the cigarette over an ashtray. Mr. Croft, how did your wife hear about my husband? From Miss Durant, was the brief answer. Howie Croft was deep in thought. Who, Corrine said, is Miss Durant? Her drinking buddy. Teaches at the high school. Durant and Bunny talk about all that kind of stuff. Would you like a drink? Corrine asked abruptly. Howie Croft looked up. You're not kidding, he said. Hey, say, what's your first name anyways? Corrine stood up and rang for Rita. By the time she sat down, his question had sufficiently cleared the room. With a drink in his hand, Howie Croft suddenly asked a question. What'd she do here in New York anyways? Corrine drank part of her drink. Then she told him what she knew or what she was able to bring herself to relate. He listened to her in a way that at first she thought was disconcertingly alert. Then abruptly it occurred to her that he was examining her legs. She crossed her legs and tried to bring her account to a rapid close, but he interrupted her. Who's this Aunt Cornelia you're talking about? Corrine stared at him. Her hands began to tremble, and she wondered if it might not be best to sit on them. She managed to ask the obvious question. Howie Croft concentrated briefly but shook his head. She's got an Aunt Agnes, he suggested constructively. Got a lot of dough, too. Runs the movie house over at Cross Point. As though there were some manual way to stop the horrible ceremony beginning to take place inside her head, Corrine put her hand to her forehead, but it was too late. Already a gallant single file of people was approaching the precipice of her brain. One by one, she couldn't stop them. They dived off. First came lovable but eccentric, faintly mustached Aunt Cornelia. Then came Harry, the sweet old kite-building butler. Then came dear old kleptomaniacal Ernestine. Then came the funny medical student and the funny dramatic student. Then came the Poughkeepsie friend of Aunt Cornelia's who was being fed through tubes. Then at last, the Waldorf Astoria itself was moved into position, given a competent push, and sent hurtling after the others. I think I'm going to faint again, she informed Howie Croft. Would you hand me that glass of brandy? Howie Croft rushed forward, semi-alarmed again, and Corinne drank what was left in the pony of brandy. When things looked all right, Howie Croft backed off toward the couch and re-ensconced himself. He gulped down the last of his highball. Then, with an ice cube clicking in the side of his mouth, inquired, What's your first name anyways? Corinne lighted another cigarette without answering. Her guest watched her, unaffronted. Mr. Croft, has your wife ever gone off like this before? How do you mean? He asked, beginning to chew the ice cube in his mouth. I mean, Corinne said with control, has she ever gone on trips with men? Listen, what do you think I am, a fool? Of course not, Corinne said quickly, politely. I let her go on trips once in a while just to break up the monotony, like. But if you're inferring, like, that I let her chase around, I didn't really mean that. Corinne hastily lied in spite of herself. Howie Croft started to work on the other ice cube in his glass. Mr. Croft, what do you intend to do about all this? About all what? Sociably. Corinne took a deep breath. About your wife and my husband going away together. Howie Croft held up his reply until he had finished crunching his second ice cube into liquid. When he was finished, he looked at Corinne, oozing with confidential confidence. Well, I tell you. What's your first name anyways? Corinne, Corinne said dully. Corinne. Well, I tell you, Corinne, strictly between you and I and the lamppost, I and Bunny haven't been getting along so good. We haven't been getting along so good the last couple of years, know what I mean? I don't know. Maybe she's had a little too much dough to spend. I'm making $110 a week now, plus expenses, plus a darn good bonus every Christmas. It's maybe gone to her head, kinda. Know what I mean? Corinne nodded intelligently. And that year she went off to college didn't do her any good. Any good, Howie Croft pointed out. Her Aunt Agnes never should have let her go. It warped her mind like. Then something strange happened. Howie Croft suddenly took off the fullback shoulder pads he was wearing under his sports jacket. Without them, he looked like a different man and required fresh observation. Something else, too. The new man said uneasily, She kind of drove me nuts. What? Said Corinne with respect. She kind of drove me nuts, he repeated. Know what I mean? Corinne shook her head and said, No. Say Howie. Howie, Corinne said. Attagirl, yeah. She kind of drove me nuts sometimes. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It wasn't too bad when we first got married, but I don't know. She got funny pretty quick. Mean. Mean with me. Mean with a kid, even. I don't know. He suddenly blushed. But he broke off. He shook his head. Once she what? Corinne demanded. I don't know. It doesn't matter anyways. I forgot about it already. She just changed a lot. Boy, I can remember how she used to come to all the games when I was playing football, basketball, baseball. She never missed a one. His mouth tightened. He was almost finished. I don't know. She just changed a lot. He was finished. He could look over at Corinne easily now. Some trusty interior whistle had blown just in time. The mollycoddle reason had been taken off the scrimmage line, and good old Hammerhead Jukes was back in his old position. This is darn good bourbon you got, Corinne, he said, brandishing his empty glass. But Corinne stood up. She said something about a previous appointment. She thanked him for dropping by. Howie Croft looked disappointed by the abrupt termination of his visit, but he immediately stood up and allowed Corinne to lead him to the front door. On the way, he turned to address her. I'm going to be in town a couple of days. Okay if I give you a ring? How about us doing the town? I'm sorry, I'm afraid not. He shrugged, undeflated. He put on a light gray hat in front of the hall mirror and creased it tenderly. Maybe you could tell me a couple of shows I ought to see while I'm in town. Stage shows. This Broadway Haya, any good? Yes. Howie Croft, his hat finally set satisfactorily on his head, turned in the doorway. He grinned at Corinne. Don't look so worried, like, he recommended. You're better off. You're better off in the long run. If your husband's as nuts as my wife is. At that point, Corinne let go of the doorknob and everything else. She informed Howie Croft at the top of her voice that she wanted her husband back. Howie Croft fled into the elevator when it arrived, and Corinne went inside her apartment and closed the door. Her legs then dissolved, and she slipped to the floor, sobbing. Later, she went to her bedroom and at once took some sedative capsules. When she awoke at one of the timeless hours people awake from strong sedatives, she felt something crushed damply in her hand. She pressed the object into shape, then turned on her bed lamp. Howie Croft's personal card was in her hand. She stared at it. Then she lay still for several minutes, looking at her dim reflection in her dressing table mirror across the room. Suddenly, she asked herself aloud, "Who the hell are you, bud?" The question struck her very funny, and she laughed for a quarter of an hour. Corinne never stopped trying to find out where Ford had run off to. Neither did Ford's publisher stop trying. Neither did Columbia. Often they all thought they had a lead, but invariably it faded away over a long-distance telephone call or died between the simple declarative sentences of some hotel manager's letter. At one time, Corinne even considered hiring a private detective. She even had one report to her apartment for instructions. But she sent him back to his office unused. She was afraid he would give her a lot of dirt and no husband. Corinne's search for Ford was an intense one, but a curiously legitimate one. We now know that the itinerary of Ford and Bunny Croft, once they had left New York together, was rather like that of two quarter-blooded gypsies. We know that they turned back north when they reached Charleston, West Virginia, and back east when they reached Chicago, and that after only 10 weeks of wandering, they settled down in a middle western city. A city that obscured their liaison under a natural screen of smoke and grit. It was Robert Wayner who found out where they were living. It took him about 18 months to find out. When he did, he phoned Corinne's apartment, and by the way, he began, "Corinne, now listen, don't get excited." Corinne knew what was coming. Wayner knew that Corinne would want to go see Ford. It was his intention to go along with her, but it didn't work out that way. She lifted the facts from him over the phone, then packed a bag, and an hour later boarded a train alone. Her train got into the city Wayner had named at 6 a.m. It was November, and as she walked down the gray, empty platform toward the taxi stand, she felt sleet on her face and down her neck. Monday sleet at that. She checked into a hotel, took a hot bath, dressed herself again, and proceeded to sit in her room for the next 17 hours. She looked at 5 magazines. She had a chicken sandwich sent up to her room at noon, but she didn't eat it. She counted bricks in the office building across the street, vertical patterns, horizontal and diagonal patterns. When it got dark outside, she put 3 coats of polish on her nails. While she was waiting for her 3rd coat of polish to dry, she suddenly stood up from her chair, walked over to the telephone, and placed a hand on it. But there was an electric clock on the same table with the phone. She saw almost with delight that it was 11 o'clock at night. She felt saved. It was much too late to do any phoning. It was much too late to tell her husband all she had learned about Bunny from Howie Croft. It was much too late to find out if her husband needed money. It was much too late to hear his voice. It was exactly the right time to take another hot bath. She did so. But with the bath towel still wrapped around her, she suddenly walked straight to the telephone and asked the operator for the number she knew by heart. This is the extraordinary conversation that followed. "Hello," Bunny's voice. "Hello, I know it's late. This is Corinne Ford." "Who?" "Corinne Ford." "Corinne! Well, golly, I can't believe it." A voice full of rich, creamy delight. "Are you in town?" "Yes, I'm in town," Corinne said. Her own voice didn't sound like her own voice. It sounded like a man's, as though all her glands were through with her. "Well, golly, Corinne, I don't know what to say. This is wonderful. We've been meaning to get in touch with you for ages and ages. This is wonderful." Then, a little shyly, a little ashamedly, "Corinne, I feel just awful about what's happened and stuff." It was an apology, a rather wonderful one in a way. It wasn't delivered like any apology at all that a woman of 33 might essay while standing up to her ears in richly assorted connubial garbage. It was the apology of a very young salesgirl who has button-headedly sent the blue curtains instead of the red. Yes, Corrine said. Golly, where are you anyway, Corrine? I'm at the Hotel King Cole. Well, look now. Warm chocolate plans on the way. It's not at all late. You've got to come over here this minute. You're not in bed or anything. No. Good. Ray's in the other room working, but listen, you hop in a cab. You know our address, Corrine? Yes. Swell. Well, we're dying to see you. You hurry up now. For a few seconds, Corrine couldn't talk at all. Corrine, you there? Yes. Well, you hurry up now. We'll be waiting. Goodbye. Corrine replaced the phone. She then went into the bathroom and got back into the tub for a few minutes to get warm. But all the hot water in all the hotels in the world couldn't have warmed her. She got out of the tub and dried and dressed herself. She put on her hat and coat and looked around the room to see whether she had left several cigarettes burning. Then she left her room and rang the elevator bell. She could feel her pulse beating close to her ear the way it does when the face is pressed against the pillow a certain way. The sleet had turned to snow during the 17 hours she had spent in her room, probably since darkness, and part of an inch of slush covered the walk outside the hotel. A neon sign across the un-New York-looking street cast its ugly blue reflection on the black, wet street. The hotel doorman who got her a cab needed to use his handkerchief. Corrine rode for nearly 15 minutes. Then the cab stopped and she asked animatedly, "Is this the place?" and got out and paid her fare. She found herself standing on an empty, dark, slushy street of rebuilt tenements. But she walked up the stone steps and went through the first double door. She searched in her handbag, found her cigarette lighter, and flicked it on. A panel of names and buttons were before her. She found the name Ford written in green ink, and she pushed the corresponding button casually, like a salesman or a friend. A buzzing sound followed, and the inner door opened. Almost at once, Corrine heard her own name, with a gay question mark trailing from it, ring down a dark spiral staircase, and Bunny Croft scampered down to meet her. Bunny slipped her arm through Corrine's and said things to her and continued to say things to her as they climbed the stairs together. Corrine heard nothing. Suddenly, Corrine's coat was being taken from her, and she was being seated in a room, and she was being asked by Bunny Croft which she'd rather have, rye or bourbon. But Corrine just looked down at her own legs. She saw that her stockings didn't match. This seemed a very strange and highly provocative fact to her, and she resisted a strong temptation to lift her legs hip high, knees together, and remark to anyone within hearing distance, "Look, my stockings don't match." But she only said, "What?" "I said you look cold, Corrine. Brr! I'm going to make you a drink whether you want it or not. No arguments. Go in and see Ray while I'm doing stuff. He's working, but he won't care. Right through that door." Bunny disappeared on the run through a kitchen push door. Corrine stood up and walked over to and through the door Bunny had pointed to. Ford was sitting at a small bridge table with his back to the door. He was in shirt sleeves. An undressed, waddy little bulb burned over his head. Corrine neither touched him nor even walked directly toward him, but she said his name. Without perceptibly starting, Ford turned around in the wooden restaurant chair he was sitting on and looked at his visitor. He looked confused. Corrine went over and sat down on the chair close to his table within touching distance of him. She already knew that everything was wrong with him. The wrongness was so heavy in the room she could hardly breathe. "How are you, Ray?" she asked without crying. "I'm fine. How are you, Corrine?" Corrine touched his hand with hers. Then she withdrew her hand and placed it on her lap. "I see you're working," she said. "Oh, yes. How have you been, Corrine?" "I've been fine," Corrine said. "Where are your glasses?" "My glasses?" Ford said. "I'm not allowed to use them. I'm taking eye exercises. I'm not allowed to use them." He turned around in his seat and looked at the door Corrine had entered through. "From her cousin," he said. Her cousin? Is he a doctor? I don't know what he is. He lives on the other side of town. He gave her some eye exercises to give me. Ford cupped his hands with his right hand, then put down his hand and looked at Corinne. For the first time since she had entered the room, he looked at her with some kind of real interest. You in town, Corinne? Yes, I'm at the Hotel King Cole. Didn't she tell you I phoned? Ford shook his head. He pushed some papers around on the bridge table. You in town, eh? Corinne now saw that he was drunk. Under this awareness, her knees began to knot together uncontrollably. I'm just going to stay overnight. Ford seemed to give this remark a great deal of concentration. Just overnight? Yes. Narrowing his eyes painfully, Ford looked down at the papers strewn messily all over the bridge table. I have a lot of work here, Corinne, he said confidentially. I see you have, Corinne said without crying. Ford again turned around to glance at the door to the room, this time almost falling off his chair. Then he leaned forward toward Corinne, warily, like a man in a crowded, decorous room who is about to risk telling someone at his table a bit of choice gossip or an off-color joke. She doesn't like my work, he said in a surreptitious voice. She doesn't like my work, he said in a surreptitious voice. Can you imagine that? Corinne shook her head. She was now half blinded with tears. She didn't like it when she first came to New York. She thinks I'm not meaty enough. Corinne was now crying without making any attempt to control herself. She's writing a novel. He drew himself back from his confidential position and began again to push papers around on his bridge table. His hand stopped suddenly. He spoke to Corinne in a stage whisper. She saw my picture in the Times book section before she came to New York. She thinks I look like somebody in the movies when I don't wear my glasses. Then, fairly quietly, Corinne lost her head. She asked Ford why he hadn't written. She accused him of being sick and unhappy. She begged him to come home with her. She wildly touched his face with her hand. But he suddenly interrupted her, blinking painfully but sounding like the soberest, most rational man in the world. Corinne, you know I can't get away. What? I'm with the brain again, Ford explained briefly. Corinne shook her head, choked with despair and incomprehension. The brain, he said rather impatiently. You saw the original. Think back. Think of somebody pounding on the window of a restaurant on a dark street. You know the one I mean. Corinne's mind traveled unfractuously back, reached the place, then partially blacked out. When she looked at her husband again, he had picked up a movie magazine and was squinting at its cover. She turned her eyes away from him. Staying in town, Corinne? He asked politely, putting down the magazine. Corinne didn't have to answer because her hostess's voice suddenly hollered from the other side of the door. Hey, open up, you two. My hands are full. Ford rushed awkwardly to open the door. A highball was suddenly deposited in Corinne's boneless hand. The other two people, with glasses of their own, sat down. Ford at his messy little bridge table and Bunny Croft on the bare floor of the other side of the table. She was wearing blue jeans, a man's t-shirt, and a red handkerchief knotted cowboy style around her throat. She stretched out her legs pleasurably as though a good bull session were about to begin. You're terrific to come and see us, Corinne. It's marvelous. We were going to go to New York last spring, but somehow we never did. She pointed a moccasin foot at Corinne's husband. If this big lug would stoop to writing for money once in a while, we might be able to do a couple of ambitious things. She broke off. I love your suit. You didn't have that when I saw you in New York, did you? Yes. Corinne wet her lips with her highball. The glass was filthy. Well, you didn't wear it. At least I didn't see it. Bunny crossed her legs lightly. How do you like our dive? I call it the rat's nest. I may have to sublet one room. Then Ray'll have to sleep in the medicine cabinet, won't you, darling? What? Ford said, looking up from his drink. If we sublet this room, you'll have to sleep in the medicine cabinet. Ford nodded. Bunny turned to Corinne, asking, where are you staying in town anyway, Corinne? At the Hotel King Cole. Oh, you told me. I love that little bar downstairs with all the swords and stuff on the wall. Have you been in it? No. The barkeep looks exactly like some guy in the movies, some new guy, but exactly. I can never think of his name. Ford stirred in his chair and looked over at Bunny Croft. Let's have another drink, he suggested. His glass was empty. Bunny looked back at him. What am I supposed to do, jump? She inquired. You have the combination to the bottle. Ford stood up, holding on to the back of his chair, and left the room. He was gone about 5 minutes, or 5 days so far as Corinne knew. Bunny spoke to her steadily in his absence, but she missed nearly all of it except about the novel. Bunny said she hoped Corinne would have time while she was in town to at least take a look at her novel. Ford came back into the room with about 4 fingers of undiluted whiskey in his glass. Then Corinne stood up and said she had to go. Right now? Bunny wailed. Well, look, what about having lunch with us tomorrow or something? I'm leaving on an early train, Corinne said, starting to walk out of the room unescorted. She heard her hostess spring to her moccasin feet, heard her say, well, golly. All of them, Ford too, filed toward the front door of the apartment, Corinne first, Bunny at her heels, and Ford in the rear. At the door, Corinne abruptly turned around in such a way that her shoulder was adjacent to Bunny's face, partially blocking off Bunny's view. Ray, will you come home with me? Ford did not hear her. I beg your pardon, he said politely, unforgivably. Will you come home with me? Ford shook his head. The action over, Bunny came briskly out from behind Corinne's shoulder, and as though no entreaty of real significance had just been made and rejected, took Corinne's hand. Corinne, it's really been terrific seeing you. I wish we could all write each other or something. I mean, you know. Are you still in that same place in New York? Yes. Swell. Corinne took back her hand and extended it to her husband. He half pressed it, then she took it away from him. Golly, I hope you'll get a cab all right, Corinne, in this weather. Oh, you'll get one. Turn on the hall light for Corinne, stupid. Without looking back, Corinne went as quickly as she could down the stairs and broke into an awkward, knock-kneed kind of run when she reached the street. The end.